Time for another video, and before we get started, a big thank you and shout out once again to everyone who has liked and subscribed so far. This is a channel dedicated to helping others improve as artists in the most efficient manner possible by leveraging the research of neuroscience, meta-learning, and autodidacticism. And today I'm going to be repainting the two baseline paintings that I've picked as a way of gauging my progress and development as an artist. I originally painted these two images back in February 2024 as a way of setting a baseline from which to measure my growth. My intention is to repaint these after every 200 hours of study and to try and bring to the table all the lessons I've learned since the last attempt to hopefully produce an improved version of each. I do not count this towards my 10,000 hours training, at least as far as the short posts for this channel are concerned, as they're not really specific study sessions, although I will of course still learn from them. That means on days when I work on these, I still do my 1 hour of training. The reason I'm able to train for 1 hour per day and paint a longer format study for this video is simply that I took some time off work. It'll be back to just 1 hour training a day soon enough. Now, these are not fair tests in the true scientific sense, because for that to be the case, I would have to do things like set myself the same time limit or paint the exact same image. But as you'll see in this video, an unexpected part of undertaking my studies has been that I now realise some of the mistakes I made last time around were related to things so fundamental that I've had to make some major changes which have completely altered the original paintings. The best way to think about this, therefore, is as an exercise in improving previous paintings with newfound knowledge and skill, and applying that in a more finished painting kind of context. One of the things that many more experienced artists have told me in my conversations with them here on YouTube is that I would potentially make much faster progress if I didn't do so much daily study and just spent that time making actual finished level portfolio paintings and drawings. While that is a fair point, it's important to understand that the way I am approaching learning art for this experiment is not the same as what may be practiced traditionally. It's actually better to compare my approach to athletic competition. If we look at professional footballers or tennis players, they train every day, working on both fundamental skills as well as targeted drills on things they need to have to improve their performance. The actual performance, however, does not occur as frequently as the training. Footballers here in the UK play typically 1 or 2 games per week. If they train for 5.5 hours a day on average, 5 days a week, that's 27.5 hours of training for a mere 3 hours of actual game time per week, where the training is called upon for real-world use. A professional pianist or singer will also practice every day, but might not have a performance every day. And this is the same for most high-level skilled practitioners. Boxers and MMA fighters do not have actual damaging full-contact fights every day, but they do practice daily. The point I'm trying to make is that most professionals generally spend more time training than they do performing their skill. Therefore, I try to spend a lot more time working on building up my skill and less time on making these portfolio level paintings, at least for the time being. Despite the performances obviously being great learning experiences, they take me away from the training and my time is limited most days. A good concept painting may take many hours to produce, and if a lot of that time is spent on things like rendering, that's time I could spend working on a weakness or learning something entirely new. I'm not a professional artist and my livelihood does not depend on me making these finished pieces, so I have the luxury of being able to take this approach and see how it benefits me, if at all. So, for every 200 hours of study, I'll spend a good few hours painting something more polished and finished and test myself out. This is the performance, where we see if the training has paid off and learn what is still sorely needed to compete at an even higher level. The first painting was a digital piece which I made in Photoshop with a Wacom Intuos tablet. I picked a couple of characters from Street Fighter just because I felt they were recognisable. I have a male and female character, I have some different fabrics, textures to paint, as well as some anatomy. I only painted the characters last time and did not include a background, and it took just a couple of hours in total to create. There are, looking at this now, a bunch of things wrong with it that are jumping out at me, having not seen this image for probably 6 months or so. There are some weird perspective and proportion issues. Ryu's lead foot looks huge and his rear one seems to be too high off the ground, and Chun-Li's foot is between his legs but her torso and nearest shoulder seem like they're in front of Ryu. It would be better to have more overlap here so that one character is more clearly in front of the other. The lighting also doesn't really sell their positions very well. There isn't enough contrast in the values to create depth, and the lighting is inconsistent. There are shadows on the back of Ryu, but not Chun-Li. No shadows on the faces or hair, and so the brain gets confused looking at this. It sees some forms as more three-dimensional and others as flatter. I have no idea what's going on with Ryu's chin, it's way too narrow, and he has a tiny mouth, and his ears are in the wrong place. He has no cheekbones and his head is too wide at the point level with the eyes. Both characters' nearest forearms are way too long. Ryu has a weird bicep that should be flexed, not indented inwards. The torn shoulder strips do not really feel like they actually overlap and sit above his deltoids. The clothing is not great, but this is something I haven't really studied, so I'll live with that for now and just try my best to make everything else a little better. I deliberately did not paint a background last time, and I think I'm going to keep that as the case this time, but the composition and pose is just boring. Let's repaint this and try to create a better composition, fix the anatomy issues, at least as well as my current knowledge will allow, and fix the lighting and value issues by pushing them a bit further and making the light direction more consistent. A big error I committed last time was not planning the painting. I've since learned that a better approach would be to create some smaller thumbnails to play with things like composition, lighting and colours, and other aspects of the piece to find ways to make it interesting. So let's go and do that first. I decided to play about with poses, and I do this by blocking in shapes as well as using lines to try and create forms that I think will look good. The canvas is going to be 16:9 landscape format, so I need something that works within that aspect ratio. Blocking in forms feels like quite a good way to work here because it covers a lot of ground quickly, and by using just 3 or even 2 values you can set up the final lighting and values of the painting at this very early stage. At first, when doing this, I found it quite tough to generate ideas, but was pleasantly surprised that my work on perspective and basic figure drawing made me able to position the camera anywhere in the scene, and because I'm using simple block figure shapes, I can quite quickly establish a fairly decent perspective scene with some poses in action. One of the other things I started thinking about that I haven't really discussed on this channel yet is harmony and contrast, which I put under the composition skill pillar. But really it's a common thread that permeates every part of a painting. I leaned into the idea of making Ryu bigger and more muscly, and Chun-Li a bit more petite and feminine, and playing with the contrast of that. You can see me doing other things when creating these, such as rotating or angling the shot. This is sometimes called dutching, and it can make the scene feel a bit more dynamic and action-packed, so I played with that too. As mentioned, I'm not too fussed about a background, but I ended up wanting to hint at one, so I placed a few lights in the background. This means the lighting I want to go for would have the characters generally backlit, and therefore the actual character silhouettes will be darkened and in shadow. By placing the lights behind key areas like a subject's head, I can make that the point in the painting where the contrast is highest and draw the eye there. Couple that with the fact that our eyes tend to jump to faces when they first see any image, and I can make a focal point quite easily and hopefully control where the eye will go. Another thing I'm beginning to get into here is storytelling. The previous painting was just 2 characters stood there, but now I'm playing around with them fighting each other or even fighting another group of characters. I didn't want to draw anyone else though, so ended up just settling on a scene featuring these 2 characters. I ended up liking this one as a favourite. I actually made this decision by zooming out the thumbnails so that they're really tiny and walking away from them for about 30 minutes. When you return and look at the images, you really just quickly see them as interesting compositional shapes, kind of abstractions. Some seem very interesting and draw the eye in right away, and others are fairly boring, so I picked one that felt like it worked at that tiny scale because in theory it should also be interesting at a much larger scale. You may remember from the first time I covered this painting that I was very much inspired by and chasing after the level of skill displayed by my senpai artists. These are 3 artists who I use as a lodestar to guide me to producing work like they can. Another huge error I made was just not spending enough time on the painting. I thought that a painting like this would take an artist over at a studio like 6 More Vodka around 8 hours to produce, but it turns out that number is closer to 100 hours. I have nowhere near that level of free time to spend making something like this. I really only train for 1 hour a day because I work full time, but I'll be able to spend 1 hour a day on this painting for maybe the next week to see how far I can push it in 7 to 8 hours. So I'll work in 1 hour blocks, then stop for the day, which forces me to evaluate my progress every time I restart, seeing it with fresh eyes the following day and pick something to work on next time. I didn't intend to use any references for these, other than the references for the characters, such as costumes and proportions, but you'll see the issue I encountered with that in a few minutes. First thing I do is take my thumbnail and try to reconfigure it to make it work on the final canvas. I chop the image up into layers and repaint a few bits to try and separate the characters and establish a little form and make sure the proportions make sense. I actually kind of like the elongated, jagged proportions I had here, but want the final piece to be a little bit more realistic, so I redid those bits. From there, I began drawing Ryu on his own layer. These lines won't be visible on the final image, and really, at times, I feel like I don't need lines when I paint, but I wanted to make sure the anatomy that you can see was there under the clothing. This angle is quite forgiving in terms of both anatomy and perspective, so I'm trying to make sure that the shapes and proportions are interesting, and for the final gi, I'm going to try and give a few interesting folds, making it seem like it's made of a fairly thick fabric. On a layer underneath this, I placed the values for Ryu, and this is where the concept of value grouping comes into play. The characters are going to make up the mid and dark tones of this image and also feature the full value range with a little bit of edge highlighting and cast shadows, which will make them the thing that hopefully grabs your attention. The gi should be fairly light, but because the light source is in the distance behind the characters, it's all in shadow. But this whole silhouette is fairly mid-tony, leading towards dark. I repeat this exact same process with Chun-Li. You can see her face, and I've done a lot of head anatomy, so I wanted to make sure I got this right to the best of my ability. I can always change it later, but I ended up being quite cartoony, which I went with in the end. Pose utilises a little more perspective, but a square-on pose like this is still generally more about shape than strict anatomy, and the cartoony aspect makes it a little more forgiving as well. The rendering phase, still in grayscale, is where this started to fall apart. You will see that I start and restart this maybe 5 or 6 times. The issue is that I just don't understand enough about planes of the head and face to realistically render them. I was trying to follow the softer cartoony shapes of the line art to get around this a little bit, but it didn't go well. Also, the actual brush strokes felt very soft and smushy, like they lacked definition, so I thought perhaps the issue was the resolution of the image, like it was too small to add the amount of detail I was aiming. By this point, I'd already spent 2 hours on it, and so I took a break to stop so I can come back tomorrow with fresh eyes and a new plan. The next day, I still did not like the way this was going, so I deleted those layers and decided that I need some help. I looked at a piece by an artist I like to try and see what values they use, and so I went and grabbed this one from 6 More Vodka. It's for Legends of Runeterra, and the reason I grabbed it is because the lighting looks similar to what I want to simulate in my scene, but of course a lot better than I'm going to be able to do it. I don't want to depend too much on this reference, and it won't help me render the forms of the head, but something about my efforts always end up being too dark. A quick analysis of this piece reveals that around 4 values are used for the skin. The value of 36 is pretty much the base colour, and then the sides that are in shadow fall down to about 20. These parts are actually lit, but indirectly, by bounce light, so they should never appear too dark. The cast shadows, like inside the ear here, are at 16, and the rim light where the sun hits the edge of the skin is 47. I'm going to try and use these values and render the skin again to see what I get. It took me a while to find the forms of the face that I could latch onto and make look at least somewhat three-dimensional, but I was able to sort of work with what I know about the head and rendering curved surfaces to have a good go at it. I also noticed other things wrong with the silhouette, the size of the facial features and perspective as I progressed. At this point, I'm finding that the biggest issues are the lack of anatomical knowledge, and now, despite being able to generally draw heads from imagination, I seem to be struggling with this one and probably didn't do that good a job of drawing it. I can only render what I have drawn, and a bad drawing will always lead to bad rendering. There is also a technical skill issue here, which is that despite a small selection of brushes I got from a brush pack by the artist Max Grech, I can't seem to make things blend as smoothly and evenly as the reference I grabbed. I normally paint in values with just hard, sharp edges, and this soft transitioning is not something I've really done for a long time. When I did try it previously, I actually just used the gradient tool or an airbrush, so using a brush with texture and trying to softly blend things is not something I'm very good at right now. The more I worked on the skin though, the easier it became. The bigger, more primitive areas like arms were a bit easier to do, as the anatomy is a lot simpler and not even really needed in a cartoonish painting like this. One other thing I'm realising is that 3 hours in, I haven't even got 20% of the way around rendering the image. There's 5 hours left and I haven't even put any colours down yet. There are different workflows for making digital paintings, and I wanted to make sure the values were sound before adding colour, but maybe this is a poor choice when considering time constraints. I don't know enough about digital art to make a decision on that myself yet. At the start of the next session, the first thing I notice is Chun-Li's facial expression. She looks like she doesn't want to be there. I hadn't really considered facial expression at all, and that's something I'll have to pay attention to in the future. It's not really something I've spent much time drawing, and this is something I should begin to study alongside my anatomy. Also, the hands are just completely weird. Her right hand looks like a left hand, and her left hand looks like a cat's paw. I tried to adjust the angle of the eyebrows and fix the hands a little before starting on her clothes. These I felt actually went a bit easier, but I didn't really include any complex folds like the 6 More Vodka reference has. I did pick a few values from that again to try and see how they compare to the skin, but actually a lot of the same values seem to apply, just in different quantities. I'm not sure if I played it a little safe here and didn't push the values as far as they should go, but I didn't want to make the clothes seem really dark and contrasting to everything else. It's at this point that I started using the airbrush in this brush set, which I felt made it way easier to create the smooth transitions between the areas that I wanted. I know that it's generally not desirable to end up with an airbrushed look, but any attempts to use the more textured brush just seem to leave dirty looking marks in the soft areas, and I either airbrushed over them or used the smudge tool. If anyone knows how to make smooth airbrush-like strokes and transitions but with a textured brush, please let me know. Anyway, the airbrush is a bit more aggressive and it blots down values faster than the other brushes, so I can more quickly draw in the shapes I want as well as the rimlet parts. I then move on to Ryu, starting with his skin, which I decided to make the same as Chun-Li's. I thought I'd paint it identical and then shift it a little darker at the end, just so his skin tone is slightly different. At the halfway mark at the end of 4 hours, I have one character rendered and the second one started. I have no doubt that more professional artists spend a lot longer just getting to this stage, and their work is much better for it. But I did set myself a target of 8 hours, and I want to see what I can produce in that time, so I'm trying not to get too bogged down in one area. I felt that for some reason, around hour 5, everything suddenly went much easier, and I found little routines that began to make sense for building form. For example, I used the big airbrush to roughly get in the cylindrical form of the arm, and then adjusted the terminator of it to create some general anatomy. I finally added some bounce light where relevant to give some more depth and three-dimensionality. I tried this with the big hard chalk brush too, and now I sort of get how both brushes work together. I ended up using the chalk brush for laying in initial shadow shapes, especially on the fabric, because the little imperfections it made could be used for folds or creases and cast shadows. I tried to do as much as I could with this chalk brush and then soften the broader areas with the airbrush. This is how I approached Ryu as a whole, and I felt that he came out much more believable than Chun-Li. I'm not sure I pushed the values in certain parts like the gi quite far enough, but I figured I can always push that further later using adjustment layers. With just 3 hours to go now, I need to start thinking about bringing this into colour. To do this, I use a layer on top of each character set to colour mode. This is something that I have seen done before by a lot of artists, and it simply places the desired colour on top of your values, meaning your painting suddenly comes to life. The colours, however, do not translate exactly as expected. Colours like the red on Ryu's headband I had to desaturate a lot to get them looking correct in the lighting scenario, and not too oversaturated compared to everything else in the image. The hardest colour, and the only one I had to cheat and colour pick from a reference for, was the blue for Chun-Li's dress. That also needed to be ridiculously toned down and desaturated to make it look like the correct blue and not too overpowering. I tried to give Ryu's gi a slightly yellowish tint, and the characters have slightly different skin tones. I tried to make Chun-Li slightly cooler and Ryu slightly warmer. Once the colours are down, the image looks a lot more interesting and the characters are, I feel now, a bit more recognisable. It's amazing how characters that belong to an intellectual property or franchise can be hinted at or represented by their colour scheme alone, and that helped me out a bit here. If the likeness was way off, you would probably still know who these characters are just from the colours alone. The image at this point feels quite muddy and quite dull, so I want to try a trick that most digital artists use but I've never really tried, and that's overlay layers. Artists like Ross Draws are known for getting a drawing to a certain stage and then spamming overlay effects to make convincing glows and light blooms. I want to use that sparingly here to try and push the values a bit more and simulate that rim light. I ended up doing 2 layers of this, as one didn't seem like it pushed things far enough. I also used 2 multiply layers, and that helped me push the dark parts of the image, expanding the value range a bit more. At this point, I feel like I'm really repeating the same steps I did before, and can't help but feel that this is somewhat inefficient. There must be a faster, smarter way of cutting a lot of these steps out, but honestly, I'm in uncharted territory here. I'm just trying new things, and I'm a little apprehensive that any big changes I make will ruin the painting at this point. I don't go too crazy with the values, but I don't want the image to be too muddy either, and I feel a bit lost at this point as to what I can do to make the image better. I have 2 hours left now, which is enough time to bring Chun-Li up to the same level of overlay and multiply as Ryu, and then maybe play with some adjustment layers and try to get this as presentable as possible in the time lane. I still do not really get how to use these layers properly. I get what they do, but I don't know what colour to use for each. For the overlay, I tried using a desaturated light yellow, and that seemed to make a pretty good all-around lighting effect, but for the multiply, picking a colour tended to make the darkening non-uniform, affecting some colours in the scene more than others, and so I opted for a mid-range grey. That seemed to do the trick. The more I progressed with these layers though, the easier it became to see the forms, and so it seems that when rendering a finished piece like this, things do get easier as you progress, and it really becomes a case of just refining the forms once they are established. Of course, you do need to establish them correctly in the first place to avoid further cementing in place general weird shapes and shadows, which is something I am guilty of here in places. For the final hour, I'm really just going back and forth, thinking about how I can push or pull certain parts of the image to make them look a little more realistic or interesting. I did this with several adjustment layers. I made the lighting a bit yellower and warmer, and I also upped the contrast, making the shadows slightly darker and the bright spots a bit lighter. I've been studying values for a while, and this exercise made me realise that I draw values as nice cardboard cutouts of grey, nicely stepped and separated, and that's just fine when working with things like landscapes because this broader, more grouped value read is the best way to represent a landscape, especially when working quickly. To actually render things like clothing and skin, well, that's a lot more nuanced and complex, and it takes a lot more time and a lot more of an understanding of digital painting than I currently possess. I think that using a reference was a big help for getting me started with the values to use for the lighting that I wanted. I consider that to be a good use of reference. I made a note of the values I used and their spacing, so hopefully in the future I'll have a better gauge of what values will work. I've never done any master studies of other artists' work, at least not in the field of painting, but I can now see the benefit of this having used a reference to help guide me while working on this piece, so perhaps master studies is something I should work into my schedule at regular intervals as well. I'll look into doing this. My favourite part of the painting was probably Ryu's lead arm, which is not perfect, but I felt it came out at least somewhat three-dimensional, and the anatomy on it wasn't terrible, even though I actually haven't really studied arm anatomy in much depth yet. I felt like I have the beginnings of a digital painting method for rendering as well, which is a good starting point for producing other types of work in the future. One thing I didn't fool around with, although I know it would have made a difference, is coloured bounce light. For example, we could have had some of the blue of Chun-Li's dress reflecting onto her face or chin, and I suspect that may be why the image still feels a bit grey and dull compared to the ones I look at on the internet painted by professional artists. Doing an image like this for 8 hours taught me just how dedicated and thorough these high-end concept artists are, and that's still with them presumably using certain shortcuts and hacks to save time in a fast-paced production environment. To be able to fabricate scenes in your imagination and bring them into reality like this is a superpower to me, and I think this is what drew me to drawing since I was a kid. This is how you can tell your own stories without having a Hollywood budget behind you. Hopefully I can keep progressing until I'm able to hold my own against my senpai artists. Compared to their paintings, I need to push the contrast and lighting more, and I need to be able to model forms far more thoroughly. Also, I think I need to make more of an interesting composition again next time. I thought I had achieved that here, but already when I look at the professional paintings and compare them to this one, they have so much more going on. Even for something as simple as a character just standing alone in the scene, there's so much more visual interest. I've made a note of these, and when I try another painting after 400 hours of learning, hopefully I'll have more of an idea of how to get some of these things in there. Okay, now for the next one. The second painting is a landscape painting that I made using gouache, and this was really before I'd gotten into how to properly handle gouache and all of its intricacies, so I'm looking forward to seeing how this one comes out, because I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about both gouache and landscapes in these first 200 hours so far. The original painting was not awful, but there were things I definitely wanted to improve on. I felt that some of the big shapes were too indistinct, and everything seemed a little bit too soft. The edges seemed quite watery, the shapes of the trees and the clouds are a good example of this. Also, I tried to add too much detail for a painting of this size, and now I think that elements like the blades of grass that I tried to include before shouldn't be present at all, not at this scale. A good way to work out what to include or omit is to just squint at the image, and if you can't see something while squinting, you just don't paint it. But there's one huge issue with this painting, and it's the very thing which has led to the first major change this time around. That's that the original photo I took not far from where I live to use as a reference actually sucks. I've learned a bit more about compositions that landscape artists use since last time, and the photo I took just wasn't very interesting at all. It had no real focal point, no depth, and no interesting values or shadow shapes. So I need a new reference photo. I ventured back to the same field on a sunny day to try and capture a better photo with some more focal points, shadow shapes, and hopefully just more visual interest. I took a few photos and I liked this one the best. This was mid-afternoon, and the sun was off to my left and slightly behind me. I decided to use the tree I was standing underneath to act as a border and draw the eye into the more interesting elements like the trees in the distance. One additional thing I've learned about landscapes is that most artists actually cheat a little. They adjust what they see, or they leave parts out deliberately to either make their lives easier or create a more pleasing composition. I I feel that while the dark shadows at the top and bottom of the image are good, they encroach too far towards the middle of the picture, so I might scale them back a little. I might also paint the ground shadows a little more saturated and lighter than they appear here, as if heightening the exposure of the image a little. One way I can play with that is in Photoshop. I can literally change the exposure and brightness of the image with the curves tool, and then use this as an adjusted reference. From here, I decided to work on planning the image once again. We can create value studies very quickly by working small and using either 2 or 3 values to work out where the eye will jump to and how we want to structure our representation of this scene, as well as what we want to draw attention to. It's worth thinking about what it is you want people to focus on for your painting, and this needn't be an actual object in the scene. It might be more about the lighting, or the colour, or the way you simplify all the detail to make a softer, slightly ethereal representation of the scene. In other words, you get to pick what you want to express, and then you try your best to make that come across. This also helps you make decisions as to what is not that important, so that we can either omit them entirely from the painting, or tone them down to push them away from the spotlight. To make these, I just worked in a few different tools on regular A4 sketch paper, just experimenting to see what works. They measure a couple of inches wide, and all I'm really doing is breaking down which parts of the reference will be light tones, mid-tones and dark tones. This is that value grouping idea again, and it's super important, especially in landscapes. The biggest thing I found while doing this is that by redrawing the image multiple times at a smaller scale, you gradually figure out where certain elements will sit on the canvas and their relative size. That should make the final painting much easier, as you've already done a bunch of trial runs. I also look for shapes in the image, like ovals, triangles and rectangles. You can see that these trees are pretty oval shaped, and that the grassy field is kind of rectangular, and the tree branches and ground lines sort of guide the eye in towards this high contrast area, which I'm using as the focal point. It also gives me a heads up as to what might be hard to paint. The tree branches coming in from the top are really hard to make look good even at this scale. By squinting at them, they're really nondescript blobs of dark tone, so I'll try to be a little rough with them in the final painting to draw less attention there. I debated whether or not to try and produce this painting on a different size piece of paper and using a different paper type, but I've decided to use the exact same sketchbook as I used before. It's a moleskin and it takes gouache paint pretty well, and I've seen other artists who I admire produce really decent studies at a similar scale to this, so hopefully I can achieve something similar one day as well. Speaking of which, I decided that I wanted to gather some senpai images to look over before starting, and recently I found myself really drawn to the work of Michael Relf. I really like the way that he captures scenes as simple shapes of colour, and so I spent some time looking at his work and how he handles things like trees and shadow shapes and highlights before I started. The idea is to sit and paint this in a single sitting, minus any drying time, which I expect to take no longer than 2 hours maximum. Most of the artists I admire can comfortably capture a scene en plein air, that is outdoors and at the actual location, within this time frame and produce really good results. Obviously my piece won't be as good as theirs, and I will be making this indoors from a photograph, but the goal of capturing a simplified version of the scene is the same. I haven't really covered in depth what I use to paint yet, so I'll do that quickly here. The brushes I use are nothing special, they're just synthetic round and square brushes of various sizes by Meeden. The paint is Winsor Newton Designer's Gouache, but I'll be using another brand for one thing in a minute. I have a little glass pot of water and some rag, which I use to dry my brushes after cleaning, or to remove any excess paint for creating textures with a dry brush. This palette is a recent addition, and it's a Stay Wet palette by the Army Painter. It's actually designed for painting gaming miniatures, but it does okay for more traditional painting as well. The idea, in case you've never seen one of these before, is that it comes with a little foam insert that you let soak in water, and then you place this parchment type of paper on top. Your paint then sits on the paper, and the water from the foam underneath everything soaks into the paper just enough to stop your paint from drying out. This means you can actually keep the paint wet for 2 to 3 days when sealed up, and so continue a painting without your colour mixes drying out. Gouache paint can be reactivated once it's dried, so you don't need one of these at all, but I've found it's never quite the same as having fresh, wet paint. The reason I started using this is that over the summer, the paint I was using would dry out so fast that I needed a smarter solution to my traditional ceramic palette. The only downside to this is that it seems the paint is never exactly as thick as from the tube. Essentially, the mere act of putting it onto the palette surface dilutes it, if only slightly, and makes it a little more transparent and thinner than not using the Stay Wet palette. but it's not really an issue for me personally. You will see during the course of painting this image that the paint blobs slide down the palette and get all messy. That's because I have to angle my drawing board for recording, so I ended up with contaminated colours, but it's all part of the fun. I use some simple, delicate surface tape to mask the area I will paint, but before that I want to draw the scene onto the paper. I use watercolour pencil for this because it dissolves when you start painting. Using graphite might mean the pencil will always show through, and I don't want that here. Last time I did this though, I drew the image first, then applied a tone to my canvas and washed away the drawing. So today I'm going to tone my canvas first and then draw on top. Toning a canvas is something I like to do because it helps establish an underlying colour that is actually going to be partly visible through all the colours that go on top, unifying the palette. You can use any colour you want, but I try to make it match the overall colour of the lighting in the reference image, which seems to me to be a yellow tone. Because gouache is not waterproof, I use acrylic gouache for this. This is Turner paint, and once dry it won't rub away or reactivate when I paint on top of it. I just make a nice amount of thinned paint with water and apply it with a big brush. When totally dry, which takes no more than a few minutes, I can draw on top of it. I used permanent yellow deep for this, and when I did it I thought it might be a bit much, but decided to go with it and see what happens. Next up I want to do a quick colour swatch test. This is actually quite important when working in gouache because one of the little quirks is that it dries differently to how it looks when wet. This means the painting that looks awesome as you're making it can look very different when you look at it the next day, as all the darks get lighter and all the lights get darker. To prevent this oversight, most pro artists who use gouache will make sample swatches that they actually keep in a folder or a sketchbook that show them what the paint colours look like when they dry, so they can make better judgments when mixing colours. I've not really done this yet, but I mix up some colours that I think I'll use here and see how they dry just on the paper. The mixes will stay wet thanks to my palette. When you get a beginner's set of paints, it comes with all of these colours and it's hard to know what colours to use. You can paint pretty much anything with red, blue, yellow, black and white, but the colours you can make will be a little limited. I like to use a warm and cool version of each primary colour along with black and white. In addition, because this is a landscape and features lots of green, you benefit from having a few extra yellows as well as a warm, cool and neutral green. I only have a neutral green, but I do have 4 yellows, and that should be enough to cover everything here. It also helps to have a couple of earth tones, like umbers and siennas. This looks like a lot, but I will not be using all of these. It's useful to have them nearby just in case. So how do you start a painting like this? It's the most intimidating part, and I like to have a logical plan that I can execute as I progress. I found that it helps to work from the biggest shapes to the smallest and to go from light to dark. But there is no right or wrong way, and depending on the actual subject you will have to adapt what you do. One more consideration for gouache is that I don't want to go back on top of areas too much once painted in because of reactivation. So it will also be better for me to work from the background to the foreground. Also, for gouache specifically, we can consider consistency. I want the paint to be fairly thick and opaque, but to get started it's okay if the paint is a little thinner. We could approach this entire painting more like a watercolour and paint with very thin gouache all the way through, even working wet into wet, but I want my painting to hopefully look more like the work by my senpai artists, and so thicker paint is a requirement to get that look. A good place for me to start will be the sky and the sunlit grass. I'm still not that good at mixing colours, and I find it tough to allow for the optical adjustments that change colours as we place them in the painting next to one another, but I'll do my best. The blue for the sky ended up needing to be virtually white, with only a hint of a cool blue and a little Naples yellow. The green sunlit grass I initially tried with green, but actually it was mostly white and that permanent yellow deep again. There wasn't much green in it. I added a little of the lemon yellow to it to try and warm it and lighten it. Whenever you add white to a mixture, you make it more opaque, so it will mostly blot out the permanent yellow underneath, but it's still there, unifying everything. When I looked at my senpai artists, they really emphasised the contrast in their paintings. This was the first mistake that I made. When I started the foreground shadow colours, I made them way too light. And I don't mind this too much, as it's sort of like glazing, and I can always go back and make things a different value later on. But it shocked me just how many times I had to go back, not just once, but 2 or 3 times to darken everything down. To get the shadows warm and slightly red, I used burnt umber with permanent green to make a very dark green-brown and a little black. To make things super dark yet warm in places like the bottom left corner, I used burnt umber and black. The earth tones like burnt umber have been a real game changer for me because they allow me to tweak colours a certain way, like making them slightly warmer and redder, or darker or greener. The hardest part by far were those tree branches at the top. I was kind of careful in the beginning, but then thought, no, I need to try and be a little bit looser, more gestural here. So I tried to use the biggest brush possible and just sort of dab the shapes in. It's important to remember that I am squinting when I look at the reference, and so the final painting will be as if I am squinting at a landscape. This is why I'm just sort of placing spots of dark here and there, because that's what I can see when I squint. I once again had to go back and make this much darker, and I switched to a smaller brush to try and build up a little more form. The more you progress into a painting, the easier it gets by far. You have all the colours made, and if you need to tweak one a little, it's quite simple to just make an adjustment on the palette and then paint it in. I spent about an hour working into the areas with a medium and then small brush, adding little details and trying to build a bit more form. I held back deliberately because last time, remember, I pushed for too much detail. I also tried to use the colours and values to build form in places. Remember, the sun was off to the left and slightly behind me, meaning the left side of the trees will be a bit of a lighter yellow-green. This was late summer/early autumn here in the UK. I think I did okay at modelling this in the little copse of trees on the right hand side, and I also tried it on the bushes on the left edge of the painting. I tried to vary the temperature a little with these by using different yellows. Yellow seems to be super important in landscape painting, and having 3 or 4 yellows really is useful for quickly changing your greens to be totally different. My recent work in rendering for the digital piece I think actually helped me to consider the forms and how to make the trees look a bit more three-dimensional with just singular brush strokes. If you can do something in a single brush stroke, that often seems to be the best way to express an idea. Just let the viewer's brain fill in the blanks. You guys have seen the reference photo, but if you go and show this part of the video to someone else who hasn't seen it and ask them what this is a painting of, they should be able to work out what it is, and that's all that really matters to me for now. I deliberately stopped a little before I thought I was done, because I don't want to overwork things, and I find that by just stopping a bit before you feel finished is helpful. I was quite pleased with how this one came out, but there are of course things that I would like to improve on next time. The biggest thing when I look at paintings by artists like Michael Relth and Angela Sung is that the shapes and edges they make are much more distinct than I managed. Everything is quite clearly defined as a circle, square or triangle, and the edges are quite hard. There is also a lot more atmosphere, and it feels like the scene is actually lit up and glowing. This is something I have seen Nathan Fowkes and James Gurney do before as well, and it amazes me that this can be achieved with paint. My painting feels a lot less atmospheric and more flattened as a result. Also, they have a lot more nuanced colour. This is likely because they were painting from life and I used a photo, because when you are at a place, physically seeing and painting it, you can see colours and things that just don't show up on camera or on screen. It's something I'll have to try as an experiment at some point, so look forward to that. In all, I feel I have made an improvement as an artist, and even though this is not a perfect comparison to the works I produced before, you can hopefully see that my skill and ability have progressed. But perhaps more importantly, my thinking and reasoning skills when planning and producing work have changed. I learned a whole bunch from doing this, and the things it has brought into focus mean that I can now course correct my daily Anki card training to help and correct some of the issues I have at this point in time. By adjusting course like this, I'll be working on what are hopefully my biggest weaknesses, and so by correcting those I can make more leaps in my ability. I will repaint these again at the 400-hour mark, which will be at some point I think in the spring of next year. Thank you to everyone who commented telling me that it was important to produce finished works. You are absolutely correct. While I will be keeping to this timing and routine of once every 200 hours, I might start producing some more finished works that I can focus on for the hour that I train every day. If I can get more spare time in the future, I may work on these as little side projects and experiments. The main things I think I need to get a better grip on for next time are a little more skill with anatomy, the ability to better render more complex organic forms and depict a wider range of lighting conditions, spot even simpler shapes while painting and be able to express them in as few brushstrokes as possible, and a better understanding of hard and soft edges as well as how and when to use each. That's quite a lot to get through, but hopefully I can try and push forward at least a little bit in all of these and then come back and apply it all next time. My next video will finally, hopefully, be the one on accelerated learning, and I'm also working on an Anki deck that I can share with those curious to see what it's like to train as I do, to sit alongside a 10,000 hours Discord server. Sorry it's taking a while, but I want to take my time to make sure I get this right. I'm still optimistic that it will be released before the end of this year, so hopefully you can look forward to that. Thank you for watching today, and I will see you next time.